I compose a lot of music for different projects. There's one rule I use that helps me write better music with less stress, less overwhelm, more fun and creativity. When I forget this rule, which is too often, writing gets harder, more overwhelming, less creative, not so fun. So I'm going to show you that rule, plus 3 different examples of how I've used it and how you can use it too. So here's the rule. The more limits you set, the more freedom you get. This comes from the legendary composer Igor Stravinsky. He said, the more constraints one imposes, the more one frees oneself of the chains that shackle the spirit. And he goes even further. He says, my freedom will be so much the greater and more meaningful, the more narrowly I limit my field of action, and the more I surround myself with obstacles. And this is one of the greatest composers of the 20th century. So the reason I'm making this is because I was producing for a client recently, and I was getting overwhelmed by the scope of the project. You know, I work in a modern DAW. I've got literally hundreds, if not thousands of instruments to choose from. It sometimes feels like when I scroll through my library, I just have infinite options. And in reality, it's just too much. What winds up happening is you get decision fatigue, and it can make a project feel really overwhelming and daunting. So the answer is to set limits. This narrows your focus down. Instead of thinking, how do I make this song with infinity options? It becomes, how do I make this song with only 4 instruments, or with only these notes, or with only these plugins? And then the whole creative act becomes this fun challenge or problem to solve, rather than an overwhelming obstacle to overcome. So let me walk you through 3 ways that I've used limitations recently in my own music, and how you can do it too. The first limit is limit your instruments. I find it interesting that so many of the great composers wouldn't mainly write just for orchestra, and I think it's so tempting for amateur composers to always want to write for full massive orchestra. But the great composers were so often writing for very few instruments, string quartets or trios or quintets, just 3, 4, 5 instruments. I remember talking with Austin Wintory, and he says, I'm composing my next game score for 4 tubas. And I said, why 4 tubas? And he said, because I want to. And I sort of get that, because when you create these constraints or limitations, it makes the rest of the creative act a lot more fun. How do I make this game score work with just 4 tubas? So here's how I used it. I had to write this arrangement of In the Bleak Midwinter, A Christmas Carol, for only 3 high voices. And weirdly, I found this much more fun than when I've written choral music for 8 voices or 16 voices. Writing for just 3 voices creates all these mini challenges. You know, how do I create harmony and melody from only 3 voices? How do you create motion and momentum from 3 voices? And there were other things, like how do I make sure each voice gets to sing 1 verse? And then how do I smoothly change key so that here the alto can sing a verse in her range? How many different textures can I create with just 3 lines? I loved finding this one for the final verse where it goes, I guarantee I wouldn't have come up with that kind of texture or something nearly as nice if I'd been writing for 16 voices. And writing in this way also created more surprises for me. It reminded me of the beautiful simplicity that you can create from just 3 lines. Like if you listen to this ending. That all comes from limiting your scope. If I hadn't limited it, that would never have been written. I'll put the whole piece on my channel in case you want to listen to that, or if you want to perform it, write to me, you know, I'd love that. The next way I impose limits on my composing is by limiting the number of notes. Limit the scale. So I wanted to write something huge and orchestral, you know. Shamefully, I actually never finished this project because real life got in the way. But in order to set a limit, I decided to limit how many notes I was allowed to use in the scale. This was inspired by Alan Silvestri. I'd been studying his score to Back to the Future, and I loved how he would use the octatonic scale in action sequences. And I wrote them on a piece of paper. So I think it was E, F sharp, G, A, B flat, C, C sharp, and D sharp. And I wasn't allowed to use any other notes. And I was amazed at the harmonies and chords and progressions and key changes that you can come up with when you're only using 8 notes. And that limitation made composing a whole lot more fun. It made it like a game, like a challenge. You know, you're problem solving. It's no longer overwhelming, but it becomes a fun constraint. So here's a little snippet of how far you can go with just 8 notes. So the next kind of limitation I would call a creative challenge, or a creative limitation challenge. And you can go wild with what kind of limits you set here. So during COVID, I was literally locked in a friend's house for months. But the cool thing was her downstairs was filled with really interesting instruments. So I thought, what if I compose something using only her instruments? Plus any other free instruments that other people have created during COVID. And so I looked through websites like Piano Book to find free instruments that were created during lockdown. So I wasn't limiting the number of instruments I was using. I wasn't limiting the number of notes I could use. It was a creative limit. Create music using only the free things that I have around me in isolation. And that made the whole thing so much more fun. And it also created a really cool piece of content that did pretty well on my Instagram. So that's the rule, and that's just 3 of infinite ways that you can use this rule. So let me know in the comments if you have other cool ideas or constraints that you could use to make your music more creative. And that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to create some constraints to make my current project more fun, creative, and less overwhelming.